Gather around, children. It's time to talk about a long defunct, not quite sadly neglected video game company called Acclaim Entertainment. Acclaim was known for publishing many video games back in the day, mostly licensed titles published under a multitude of different labels such as Arena Entertainment, Flying Edge, and of course, LJN, maker of toys. For about a decade, Acclaim had a rather fruitful partnership with the World Wrestling Federation that resulted in a number of games based on the WWF, some being better than others. However, during the height of the Monday Night Wars between the WWF and rival promotion World Championship Wrestling, Acclaim's offerings in the 32-bit, 64-bit video game generation weren't exactly getting the warm reception they were hoping for, especially when compared to THQ's own line of WCW video games on the Nintendo 64, perhaps some of the better wrestling games ever conceived. And when the WWF saw how good WCW games were doing, they dumped Acclaim and signed a deal with THQ to produce video games, forming a long, fruitful partnership that would continue for many years. As for Acclaim, well, they didn't drop out of the wrestling game altogether, managing to land a licensing deal with regional promotion Extreme Championship Wrestling, a relatively small outfit operating out of Philadelphia that gained a sizable cult following for its hardcore wrestling style, mature content, and just offering something completely different from the other big two. And so Acclaim conceived ECW Hardcore Revolution for Sony PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Dreamcast. For today's review, we'll be looking at the PlayStation version, since that's the only version I've got. ECW Hardcore Revolution is the first of two video games to represent Extreme Championship Wrestling, as well as the first wrestling video game from Acclaim not to feature the World Wrestling Federation in any way, shape, or form. Well, that's only partly true, but let's not jump the gun here. Hardcore Revolution has 40 plus ECW wrestlers, some of which you have to unlock, your usual career mode where you can compete and win championships, the Create a Wrestler feature, which has become standard at these type of games, a Create a Pay-Per-View mode, which is kind of fun for a lark, customizable arenas where you could create your own personalized arena, long before WWE 12 reintroduced the concept, and a multitude of match options including your usual street fight, first blood, tag team, elimination, battle royal, and barbed wire match, just to name a few. Now to be fair, most of these features can also be found in the previous WWF Attitude game, the last Acclaimed entry before the WWF jumped ship. Well, actually, not all of it. The barbed wire match is kinda new, but still. The game engine in Hardcore Revolution is pretty much the same thing as in Attitude and Warzone, the two games prior. And if you've played those games, you pretty much know the drill. Each wrestler has a wide variety of wrestling holds and maneuvers at your disposal, provided you know how to pull them off, usually with some button combination, much like in a Tekken game or a Street Fighter game. If you don't know how to do the moves, there's a move list available for your reference in the pause menu. It works about as well as it did in Warzone and Attitude, but perhaps that's a problem. It's virtually unchanged from its predecessors, and thus possesses the same problems. The action feels a bit slow, the engine's a bit cumbersome, relying on extraneous button combinations that are too numerous to recall, resulting in gamers either dipping into the move list all too often, or foregoing the more complex moves altogether and sticking with simple but repetitive maneuvers, by proxy making the matches too boring for the crowd to care, because crowd interaction is key, you know. And this is indeed a most enthusiastic crowd for an ECW event. And even if you do know the moves, without having to resort to the move list, control tends to be on the finicky side of things. More often than not, I would want to go for a slightly advanced move like a DDT or a pile driver, input the proper command for such move, and end up with a wrist lock maneuver. This issue ends up being something that makes the game hard to pick up and play, and a near frustrating affair for novice players. Once you get the hang of it though, and it becomes a little more tolerable, but a game like this called for something a little more intuitive than this pre-existing setup. After two games with this setup, it really feels old and clunky. Old and clunky is not a good thing, especially when there are alternatives that not only play simpler, but play better and are probably more enjoyable as a result. And it doesn't help that the collision detection in Hardcore Revolution is a bit flaky at times. But perhaps most poignant of all, Hardcore Revolution has a rather non-extreme feel to it. All the matches and options available for you seem like they fit a promotion whose initials are not ECW and emphasizes a slower paced, pure wrestling product as opposed to the less refined, fast-paced intensity of ECW. Like I said before, there's a barbed wire match, which replaces the thick ring ropes with what they call barbed wire, which looks like ring ropes with spikes and serve only to cause minor damage to any poor sap that runs into them. Doesn't change the fact that the game's based more on grapples and less on an extreme action like inventive use of weapons, fast-paced action, crazy brawls, stuff that sold people on ECW in the first place. In terms of visuals, ECW Hardcore Revolution is almost on par with WWF Attitude, perhaps a tad better. To the game's credit, everything appears a bit more vibrant and colorful. The character models look crisp and sort of resemble the wrestlers, so that's a high point. The Acclaim wrestling games had some clean-looking character models, even if some of them moved and animated a bit stiffly, especially during the entrances, which look kind of weird, but at least they do have entrances, unlike the SmackDown games. There's still that weird blood effect that appears on random parts of the body, which looks pretty crap. Menu and loading screens look pretty decent for the most part, but it's pretty much Attitude with a different coat of paint. I mean, they made no effort in changing the presentation up a bit, so that at least gave off the illusion that it was a different game for a different promotion. Even the stock arenas included in the game resemble WWF house show sets rather than ECW arenas, which is off-putting a bit. Now, ECW often used real songs from real bands as entrance themes for the various talent in the promotion. Such songs cost money to license to various media such as video games, and understandably, Hardcore Revolution lacks these real songs. Instead, you have cover songs that sorta resemble the popular music that these wrestlers originally used. Not really much to say on that regard, it's there. As for the rest of the audio, the bell ring and the referee voiceover is unsurprisingly recycled from the previous game, and there's not much to say about the various sounds of slams, punches, kicks, and wrestler grunts featured in the game. Like the previous game, there's crowd chants. They sound like shit. I mean, really, like some of these chants are kind of god-awful, sorry to say. On the bright side, there's also sporadic commentary from the voice of ECW, Joey Styles. And it's rather serviceable stuff. There's actually some funny moments once in a while. But it's perhaps nowhere near as good as Joey Styles doing actual commentary during an actual ECW match. But hey, Joey Styles got to announce a video game on his own. I bet that goes rather nicely on his resume with that sole pay-per-view credit from Barely Legal. But I digress. You see, the key problem with ECW Hardcore Revolution, and the one thing people like to harp on, for good reason I might add, is that the game is presented too much like a WWF video game, and as such, as wrestling fans who were around during the 1990s will attest, both organizations were drastically different in terms of presentation, intensity, and content. ECW had a certain style that made it stand out from the big two, with edgier content, wilder brawls, and other nuances that struck a chord with wrestling fans disenchanted from what either the WWF or WCW had to offer. As such, it wasn't enough for Acclaim to simply recycle a years-old game engine, add some extreme talent, slap the ECW brand on it, and call it a day. The game needed to be much more than that and needed to reflect the core nature of the ECW product, and it is in this respect that Hardcore Revolution fails. ECW Hardcore Revolution, given its low-impact wrestling, virtually unchanged wrestling engine, and the decidedly lack of an extreme tonality throughout the game, could easily have been a generic, wrestling game. Unbranded wrestling game. Could have been another WWF game, and probably would have been that had the WWF not made the prudent decision to jump ship to THQ, resulting in a partnership that would produce far better video games than it would have for the brand beforehand. It's rather unfortunate that in its brief tenure, ECW never got a video game that truly emphasized the spirit of the promotion and was really representative of what the organization was all about. Instead, what ECW got were the leftovers of a game engine that had overstayed its welcome and did nothing to evolve and change with the times, or in this case, the change in brands. Now, if you enjoy the prior Acclaim efforts of WWF Attitude and Warzone and want more of the same with different talent, then ECW Hardcore Revolution will provide that in spades, because in that regard the game works well enough even if it feels antiquated. If you didn't care for those games, there's nothing here that's going to change your mind, and chances are you might be happier with the SmackDown series of wrestling games, which are faster paced and in my opinion far more enjoyable games. However, if you long for a video game that does justice to the product and legacy of Extreme Championship Wrestling, then this game is most definitely not for you. Hardcore Revolution may have ECW talent. It may have ECW arenas. It may even have the voice of ECW himself. But it forgot to include the extreme part of the ECW formula. Also, there's no Sandman, so yeah, don't bother. Now, the point is, if you enjoyed the past Acclaim efforts, you'll probably enjoy this one. Otherwise, you're not missing much.